Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. Great crowd here today for this second installment of MCEA's Green Beagle CLE series. Thanks for joining us. This is our second year of doing the Green Beagle. This is our second CLE of 2022. Before we get started, I want to let you know about our next CLE. Please join us on November 15, when we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act with a half-day symposium. The successes of the Clean Water Act are many. Rivers are no longer on fire and wastewater treatment has improved. But more than half of Minnesota's waters are impaired and new threats continue to emerge. Join us on November 15 from 1 to 5 p.m. to learn about the path ahead for clean water in Minnesota. 3 CLE credits will be applied for. You can find more information at the link below and at our website, mncenter.org. The title of today's CLE is Mining the Climate Crisis, Prioritizing Recovery, Recycling, and Reuse. You may have seen a lot of headlines in the news lately about the transition to the clean energy economy and how we'll source materials for that transition, materials which are present right here in Minnesota, like copper and nickel. We'll be talking about that topic today, including the current state of Minnesota's laws as they relate to mining and recycling. And we'll respond to some recent events, including the passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act passed this month. The code for today's CLE is 470568. My name is JT Haynes. I'm an attorney and the Northeastern Minnesota Program Director with MCEA. With us today is Abby Rogerson. Abby is helping lead our research on metals demand and recycling opportunities in Minnesota. And we have with us our CEO, Catherine Hoffman. Catherine is an attorney and has been working on mining issues in Minnesota since 2010 and is one of the state's top experts on Minnesota's laws as they relate to mining. Catherine is joining from St. Paul. Abby and I are joining from here in Duluth. A bit about our organization before we get started. The Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, or MCEA, is a nonprofit environmental law firm. In addition to our team of legislative and policy experts, we have 12 litigating attorneys, one of the things that makes us unique in the environmental advocacy space. Another thing that's unique about us is that we have program areas covering not just mining, but also climate and clean water, which puts today's topic at the center of a lot of our current work. Our expertise, especially in mining issues, extends back to our founding in the 1970s. We are a nonprofit supported by individual donors, and our Green Beagle series is free for all to attend. If you are able to support this work, please do so at the link provided below. And if you have questions during today's presentation, please feel to put them in the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So you've probably seen headlines like these in the news lately, especially in the wake of the passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act this month. You might be wondering, how does this relate to recent mining proposals that we've heard about in Minnesota? And how does it relate to the clean energy transition? Well, before we get started today, I'm going to provide a brief bit of background on mining and its long history in Minnesota, because it's important context for today's discussion. Many of you are probably at least somewhat familiar with iron and taconite mining. From the late 1800s until about 1950, the principal form of mining in Minnesota was iron mining, a high-grade form of mining used in the production of steel. In fact, for 50 years, Minnesota provided more than 2/3 of the iron used to make steel in this country. As higher grades deposits of iron started to run out, we shifted to a new process around mid-century called taconite mining, a process developed in Minnesota with taxpayer resources and which we still use today. Both iron and taconite mining have had significant economic impacts in the state, especially across northern Minnesota's iron ranges and at the port city of Duluth. Direct jobs at taconite facilities today are at around 4,000, down from a peak of around 12,000 in the late 1970s. The proposals getting a lot of attention these days from companies like Polymet, Twin Metals, and now others like Talon and Teck involve a different type of mining, sulfide or non-ferrous mining, which is aimed at metals like copper and nickel, the deposits for which are in sulfide-bearing ore. The key thing to understand about this is that these two forms of mining sulfide mining and taconite mining have significantly different environmental impacts. While iron mining has significant impacts of its own, including to the landscape and through the discharge of sulfate, which affects water quality, wild rice, and fish, the sulfide mining process involves even more dramatic impacts. That's because when waste rock from taconite or ferrous mining is exposed to air and water, it oxidizes, producing what we commonly think of as rust, which compared to sulfide mining is relatively benign. When waste rock from sulfide mining is exposed to air and water, it produces acid, which can cause the leaching of heavy metals into downstream waters, often referred to as acid mine drainage. Sulfide mining pollution tends to last for hundreds of years, and it's one of the main reasons there's so much concern about these new proposals. Simply put, we've not had a lot of good examples of clean sulfide mines elsewhere, and we've not had sulfide mining in Minnesota here at all. That's part of the context for today's CLE, as the metals you've been hearing about a lot lately, especially copper and nickel, are the product of this new and different type of mining. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and Abby. Catherine is going to provide some context on relevant mining laws at the state and federal levels, especially as they relate to the production of metals used in the clean energy economy. Abby is going to share some of our current research on Minnesota's recycling laws. And finally, we'll share a few thoughts as a panel about why all this is important and how best to move forward. With that, here's Catherine to walk us through relevant aspects of state and federal law.
Great, thanks, JT. All right, so I'm going to take about 20 minutes to talk about mineral demand and why we're concerned about it. Then I'm going to talk about state law and then a little bit on federal law as well. So let's start with mineral demand. The reason this is coming up in the headlines, the way that JT mentioned, and that we're hearing a lot about this is because of these demand projections. This is just one example. There are other organizations that do this, but this is one from the International Energy Agency that you're seeing on the screen. And I'll walk you through this a little bit so that you can understand what these graphs are showing. So these are for three particular minerals: copper, lithium, and cobalt. Nickel's not on here, but nickel is another example of a mineral that is projected to have high demand in the future. And these are all parts of our sort of clean energy transition. These are all things that, at least it's possible, we'll need a lot of in order to build out electric vehicles, for example. And so the kind of blue mountains at the bottom, that's mines that are in production. And then there's the sort of lighter blue behind it that looks like a shadow. That adds in mines that are under construction. So blue is, it's a mine that's operating, and here's what it's projected to produce in terms of output through 2030. And then you get a little bit more. There's a few more mines that are under production and will likely come online soon. And you can see that in the case of copper, it's going down a little bit. It's increasing in lithium and staying pretty steady in cobalt. Those lines at the top, there's red lines and yellow lines, and those are projected demand under a couple different scenarios, depending on how aggressively we pursue clean energy. And what you can see is that there's a gap in each case, a gap between what's expected to be needed and what's actually coming out of the mines that we have today. So a couple things I want to say about these graphs. One is that these are projections. So the International Energy Agency is a credible source. I'm not impeaching them as a source, but of course it's based on assumptions about the technology as it exists today and what will be built out. And investments in clean energy and electric vehicles are happening at an extremely high rate. The technology is changing very quickly. And so a lot could change with these demand projections. We don't know for sure that this is how this is going to go. And it's important to keep in mind that these are just projections, not certainty. The other thing is that, and this is kind of the framing I want for today, is that this gap that we're looking at between projected demand and existing mines, the question that I think a lot of people are asking is, how are we going to fill that gap? And what I'm proposing to you all today is that the answer is we should fill as much of that gap as possible through recycling, reduction, and reuse, and as little of it as possible through mining. MCA as an organization is not anti-mining. We're interested in a future where we incentivize recyclable products and we need fewer mines. And where mining companies are incentivized to improve their practices and to find ways to prevent harm to downstream communities. So in an ideal world, a sulfide mine of the type that JT described would be able to walk away from the site. Doesn't have to look exactly the way it did when they started. Maybe there's a bigger hill, maybe there's a deeper lake or a new lake, but it's clean enough to be beneficial and to be used by the local community and the wildlife. And that's actually a goal in Minnesota law as it exists today. So that's what we're exploring at MCA, is how do we use the laws to build incentives to protect clean water, to prioritize metals recovery and recycling, and to require mining companies to do better. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the state of Minnesota law. In general, Minnesota mining laws were written to promote development of the state's mineral resources. So this is just a little bit of history. Starting in 1969, this is one of the early laws on mining. The Minnesota legislature recognized that there is a need to control the effects of mining on the environment, as well as encourage good mining practices because mining is beneficial. So early on, they said, look, we know there's risks here, but we do want to encourage it while controlling the impact. And so that's the first version. At that time, however, the actual regulation of mining was pretty minimal. In 1973, we started to see a little bit more regulation. The Minnesota legislature prohibited mining without a permit issued by the commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. So now there's a permitting regulatory process for mining companies to go through in 73. 20 years later, the Department of Natural Resources adopted the laws that are specific to the non-ferrous or sulfide mining. And by laws, I actually mean rules. These are rules adopted by the agency. It's a specific chapter aimed at sulfide mining, chapter 6132. And those rules, I should say, have really not been updated since 1993. So that's something to keep in mind. In 2018, 25 years later, the DNR issued the first permit under Chapter 6132. That was issued to the Polymet mine. And in issuing this permit, the DNR cited 2 state statutes in support of the proposition that DNR has an obligation to promote mining in Minnesota. And they're the 2 mentioned here on the slide, 93.001, which is a policy for mineral development. And it says, I'll just read a little bit of the text. It is the policy of the state to provide for the diversification of the state's mineral economy through long-term support of mineral exploration, evaluation, environmental research, development, production, and commercialization. They cited another statute, Minnesota Statute 93.43, which governs leases to non-ferrous mineral producers. And it states, the business of mining, producing, or beneficiating non-ferrous metallic minerals is declared to be in the public interest and necessary to the public welfare. And the use of property, therefore, is declared to be a public use and purpose. So when DNR issued this first permit under 6132, they cited, and this was the very first finding of a great many pages of findings under this permit, they cited these statutes. So it's clear that DNR sees their goal of promoting mineral development as being fundamental to their purpose, as the legislature has told them, when they issue these permits. So in general, I would say we also have laws in Minnesota that protect water, right? And so I don't want to make it sound like we only have these laws that promote mineral development. We have the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. We have limits on water appropriations. Mines tend to be very water heavy and use a lot of water. Often they pull it from surface or groundwater. We have enforcement of the Clean Water Act at the state level. But what we see, because of this dual role where DNR is tasked with both minerals development as well as regulation, is that when the values conflict and the agency has to decide whether we prioritize water or mineral extraction wins. it was the sand, mineral extraction. So in our opinion, we haven't properly prioritized protecting water over extracting resources, because if there is that conflict right now, mining wins. Another place we see where this is kind of problematic is in Chapter 6132. Chapter 6132 has quite a few provisions, really too many to list here, in that give a lot of discretion to the DNR commissioner. So for example, how water appropriations are handled, how financial assurance, which is the damage deposit that mining companies are supposed to put down at the beginning of their operation in order to protect the state if there's like a bankruptcy, for example, during the course of the mining operation. Various decisions in the environmental review process. All of these relate directly to the cost and safety of a project, and many of them have very squishy language, I would say, that's a legal term, in Chapter 6132. They give a lot of discretion to the DNR. And so again, when the DNR is weighing these two dual roles, we see that, at least the way it's interpreted now, there is more pressure to protect and promote mineral exploration than to protect the environment. So what can we do about this? Well, there's a few things that we can do. There are a number of ways we can improve Minnesota's law to live up to the rhetoric about standards. And by rhetoric, I mean, we often hear people say things like, Minnesota has the best environmental laws in the world, which we do have some great environmental laws. I mentioned some of them earlier, like our state enforcement of the Clean Water Act and the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act. Mining is an area where honestly we've fallen behind a little bit. You know, I mentioned those rules were enacted in 1993 and have not been updated. Mining around the world has changed a lot since then. We know a lot more about the risks and we could do a better job regulating them. So I'm just going to mention 4 areas where we could improve state law. One is to require require taxpayer protection to cover unexpected spills and basin failures. So I mentioned that financial assurance law. We call it a damage deposit just because people kind of understand that concept. You put down your damage deposit when you rent an apartment, and then if your apartment's still in good shape when you move out, your landlord gives it back. It's sort of a similar concept. You put down the money at the beginning of the mining operation, ideally, and then at the end of the mining operations that closed and the site is more or less back to normal, you get your money back. The financial assurance here in Minnesota does not cover accidents or unexpected spills. It's just enough money to reclaim the site and to do wastewater treatment and other pollution prevention, which in the case of a sulfide mine, by the way, couldn't be forever. It probably is forever wastewater treatment. So that financial assurance is actually supposed to include enough money to run a wastewater treatment plant forever, which is not a way that it's not a thing we actually know how to calculate very well. But in addition to that, there are risks of spills at these sites, and that's not covered. If there was a spill or an accident and a mining company declared bankruptcy and walked away, the state would be on the hook for those costs. That would be one thing we could do. Another is we could require independent panels for review of mine plans and financial assurance. So DNR has this dual role. It would be good to bring in some outside experts to play the role of reviewing those plans to ensure that we are protecting clean water and the environment in the process of issuing these mining permits. Another thing we could do is require permittees to prove compliance with state laws every 10 years. So these mining permits, and this is true of polymets, it's also true of the taconite mines, actually. They are issued more or less forever. They don't have an end date. The Supreme Court, Minnesota Supreme Court actually had a problem with that. They sent that back because the law does say you have to have an end date. But even then, the end date is quite a ways in the future. And so what we could do is require a regular 10-year review of those permits to make sure that they're still in compliance with state law. Finally, we should ban upstream dams. So at these mining sites, there are places where they store the waste. And at the polymet site and also at many of our taconite sites as well, the waste is stored with water inside a dammed basin. And what we see in other places in the world, for example, Canada and Brazil, is those dams fail. And they fail specifically when they're built with a method called upstream construction. Brazil had a terrible accident with one of their upstream dams, and they have since banned these upstream dams and required existing ones to be decommissioned. Minnesota is actually behind here. This is not a method we should be promoting or using. That would be an improvement that we could do as well. Okay, so that's state law. I want to talk a little bit about federal law. One thing to know is that in general, there's very little federal regulation of mining. So just keep that in mind. Most of the regulation occurs at the state level. So how is this, these dual needs of the threats of mining and the need for minerals, how is it playing out at the federal level? Well, the Biden-Harris administration is trying to address this tension. Earlier this year, they released a document called Principles for Domestic Mining Reform. Now, this is just I don't even know if it's a guidance document. This is just a series of principles that the administration put out. So it doesn't change the law. It's not governing anything. However, I do think we will see executive actions moving forward, especially after the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's good to know how the current administration is thinking about these issues. So it has 11 principles. The very first one is to strengthen mining standards. It also talks about securing a domestic supply of critical minerals. It talks about engaging in meaningful tribal consultation. It talks about funding mining reclamation. So that's this damage deposit strategy that I mentioned earlier. We don't have federal laws on that, we should. Ensuring fair royalties. Sulfide mines or hard rock mines, as they're often referred to, and federal regulations do not pay royalties, using the best science and so forth. So those are things we might see, applicable moving forward. Another thing I want to mention is the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's a really big deal. It does a number of really important things related to climate action. There are long-term investments in transitioning to renewable energy, supporting electrification of homes and industry. It also puts a fee on methane emissions for the oil and gas industry. This is the first fee of its kind to hold the oil and gas industry accountable for their impact on climate change, because methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. But for today's purpose, most relevantly, the Act provides billions in incentives for electric cars through tax credits. It also makes it easier for low-income consumers to get access to that tax credit, because the credit comes at the time of sale and not later when you file your taxes. It contains a new caveat in the tax credit that encourages minerals to be sourced from the United States. However, the language of that is a little vague. It has an and/or provision that it's not clear how that will be interpreted yet. I think there's more to come there on whether the use of the tax credit will actually be limited. And then finally, the bill does have a 10% tax write-off for mining companies producing critical minerals domestically. So the long-term impacts for Minnesota are not clear yet. Every day we're learning more about what's in this act because it's quite a large document. And I think it's not, all of this will continue to shake out in the news and in the law. But there probably will be some impact to Minnesota. Bottom line, under the current regulatory regime under Minnesota state law, in addition to having some conflicting charges, our state agencies have a lot of discretion in how they approach difficult and dangerous mining questions. Unfortunately, what that means is that protection of our resources in pursuit of additional metals is not guaranteed. And in fact, we see failures in these laws all the time that prioritize extraction over protecting water. And that's why we think it's very important that we strengthen our laws to force mining companies to do better and to engage in cleaner and safer options for meeting metals demand like reuse and recycling. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Abby Rogerson, who's going to talk a little bit about recycling and reuse laws in Minnesota and some of our ideas for improvement.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. So here's a roadmap for the next 10 minutes or so. First, I'll provide some statistics about the amount of metal in two different waste streams. First from municipal waste, and second from a type of waste called construction and demolition waste. I think this data exemplifies the significant untapped potential in recycling, reuse, and waste reduction. Then I'll cover the policies that regulate these two types of waste and some opportunities to improve upon them. And I'll wrap up with a totally different topic, that is electric vehicle battery policy. I'll discuss why it's important to consider electric cars in particular when discussing critical mineral demand projections, and what we can do to manage this supply chain in a way that prevents further waste of valuable metals. All right, to start off, this slide shows data on the quantity of metal that ends up in landfills from municipal waste in Minnesota each year. And municipal waste refers to, I'll read the definition in the statute. It's, quote, garbage, refuse, and other solid waste from residential, commercial, industrial, and community activities that the generator of the waste aggregates for collection, unquote. So it doesn't include things like auto hulks, construction debris, mining waste, agricultural waste, tires, batteries, or any other material that has a separate waste stream. The Pollution Control Agency, or PCA, regulates waste management in our state, so that's who I'm citing on the screen there. And most of the laws and definitions related to waste management can be found in Chapter 115A of Minnesota statutes. So, as you can see, in 2013, about 4.5% of all municipal waste that ended up being landfilled was metal. And that turns out to be about 130,000 tons. It's kind of difficult to imagine how much metal that is. So for reference, the largest laker is the Paltragurtha with a capacity of 68,000 tons. So we could fill that ship over 2 times with all the metal that ends up being buried in landfills in Minnesota every year. So that's a Duluth reference for y'all. Next slide. Construction and demolition waste is an even bigger source of metal waste in Minnesota. It might be more invisible to most of us not working in the building sector, but it's really important to consider since we generate almost double the amount of construction waste as we do municipal waste. Construction and demolition waste includes things like pipes, wiring, siding, windows, drywall, asphalt, etc. About 2.5% of all the waste generated from construction activities is metal. The Pollution Control Agency doesn't have data on how much metal actually enters construction and demolition landfills every year. But if we apply that 2.5% rate to the agency's estimation of total construction and demolition waste generated annually, we can estimate about 255,000 tons of metal is heading to the landfill each year from the building sector. So in simpler terms, that's almost 4 fully loaded Paltragurthas. All right, so clearly there's a massive amount of metal being sent to landfills every year. Now I'm going to jump into the policies regulating these wastes and what could be done to improve recycling rates. Hopping to municipal waste again, it is regulated through county waste management plans. At least once every 10 years, all Minnesota counties are required by statute to submit a waste management plan to the Pollution Control Agency for approval. At a high level, these plans have to describe collection, processing, and disposal systems, financing, environmental conditions, and opportunities for improvement. The Pollution Control Agency's commissioner is then responsible for approving these plans, rejecting them, or deeming them incomplete. So county waste management plans, go back, yeah. They relate to recycling goals in a few ways. First, they must reduce reliance on landfilling. Second, the plans must explicitly describe proposed mechanisms for meeting Minnesota's statewide recycling goals for 2030. And then third, plans must comply with the rules of the Pollution Control Agency, which incorporate a waste management hierarchy that prioritizes waste reduction, recycling, and reuse over landfilling and waste to energy. So the statewide recycling goals there are for 2030, but let's just look at how the counties are progressing towards the goals as of 2020. The counties in Greater Minnesota, which refers to all the counties outside the metro area, they did reach their 35% goal on average with a recycling capture rate of 37.5%. That's general, it includes all waste. The counties in the metro area are pretty far off from their more stringent 75% goal at 48.3%. So that's a bit of background about the performance and the policy. Let's look at an idea for improvement now. And a lot of the ideas for policy improvement come from the Pollution Control Agency itself as part of their solid waste policy reports. One example is their recommendation to set management goals based on the life cycle environmental impacts of materials. In other words, they say more resources should go towards recovering materials with the biggest environmental impact. The agency doesn't provide a list of priority materials, but it's clear that metals are very high impact materials when you look at the full life cycle. Now, as JT and Catherine explained, metal mining is very risky and can be very environmentally damaging. It also takes a lot of energy and therefore emits a lot of greenhouse gas to extract ore and refine it to metal. This data is from the Bureau of International Recycling, and I'll just read it for those who might be listening. Recycling a ton of copper emits 65% less greenhouse gas than mining for a ton of copper, while nickel recycling produces 90% fewer emissions than mining. Landfilling metal can be highly toxic as well. From municipal waste, for example, you can imagine things like e-waste being thrown away. E-waste is highly concentrated with metals that are considered important for the clean energy transition, and it can be highly toxic when managed improperly. So it really doesn't make sense to be throwing out things like e-waste. Despite the fact that metals are energy intensive to produce, they can be toxic when landfilled, and they're important to the clean energy transition. They're not given any kind of priority in waste management planning. And the result is really mixed capture rates. So for example, you can see 30% of copper wire is captured to potentially be recycled, which means that tens of thousands of pounds are wasted every year. So obviously in an ideal world, we would have unlimited resources to spend on recycling systems, but in reality, with the limited resources we have, it makes sense to prioritize high impact materials like metal. All right, back to construction and demolition waste management. Currently, waste in this sector is only governed by landfill regulations, which do not incentivize or really even acknowledge the role of reuse, waste reduction, or recycling in proper waste management. The Pollution Control Agency went through a stakeholder process in 2019 and 2020 to identify how they could improve reuse and recycling in the sector. And they came up with 5 policy recommendations listed there. I'll discuss the 4th one today, which would require a certain percentage of construction waste to be diverted from the waste stream to be reused or recycled instead. And the ultimate goal of this policy would be to achieve a 75% diversion rate and 10% reuse rate. Currently, though, the Pollution Control Agency is pretty limited in its ability to implement this recommendation, at least in part due to a lack of data. So landfills are not required to document the quantity or type of waste entering landfills. A diversion requirement would be based on this data, so its absence is a real barrier. And one way the agency is trying to fill this data gap is by encouraging cities, counties, and private entities to voluntarily begin collecting building data during construction activities. Even though they're not required to do so, entities might be motivated to do it anyway, to comply with grant funding or bonding rules, or maybe they want to meet internal sustainability goals like LEED certification. This building data will provide insight into how the material is flowing through the construction sector, which eventually a diversion requirement could be based upon. Yeah, the idea is that the data gathering and voluntary participation will pave the way to make policy changes that could improve material recovery. So I think I'll leave it at that about metal waste and opportunities in Minnesota from municipal and construction debris waste streams. But obviously these are huge topics that we could spend hours discussing. I hope it provided a little insight into the way the wastes are managed though and how we could do better. So I'm going to switch gears to talk now about a policy that does not exist in Minnesota, but is centrally important to this conversation. And that's Minnesota's lack of an electric vehicle battery reuse or recycling policy. This is so important because the driver of metal demand and projections is often electric vehicle batteries. As you can see from this graphic, electric car batteries make up a large portion of projected mineral demand. And just to kind of explain it, the bars represent total mineral demand for clean energies technologies through 2030 and 2040 under a couple different scenarios. And then the colors within the bars represent the specific kind of clean energy technology that makes up total demand. So for example, the dark blue chunk shows the portion of mineral demand for solar panels. The lighter yellow represents the mineral demand for electric cars and batteries. And it's a large portion of total demand, and therefore it's a significant driver of increased mineral demand in general. Eventually, electric car batteries are going to run out of juice and have to retire, and we'll have to deal with them. An influx of retired batteries is usually estimated to begin around 2030. Unsurprisingly, California seems to be taking the lead in planning for this, since presumably because they have more electric cars on the road than most states. In 2018, California passed a bill that created the Lithium-ion Battery Recycling Advisory Group. This group delivered policy recommendations to the California legislature last March. I won't go too deep into them, besides to share that the most popular recommendation was a policy called a core exchange and vehicle backstop policy, which would require the entity that takes responsibility of the battery, whether it's for resale, replacement, or refurbishment, that entity would be responsible for ensuring the battery is properly managed, meaning that it's reused, replaced, or refurbished, and not just thrown away. And then the backstop part, that refers to the fact that EV manufacturers would be responsible for the battery in the event the owner doesn't want to pass it on to be resold or refurbished. Regardless of the specific policy though, it's clear that EV batteries are unique, like very different than the batteries that are currently entering our waste stream, and they'll require new laws if we're going to manage them properly. Likewise, what works for Minnesota might be different than what works for California. But 2030 is not that far off to create the infrastructure needed to ensure the minerals in retired batteries are managed in a way that keeps them in circulation. So we should be thinking about it now. And I'm sure EVs will come up in questions. So with that, I'll pass it back to JT. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Catherine. I'm getting a lot of reverb bubbles. Is everyone hearing that? Okay, well, we'll just power forward here. So thank you both, and thanks everyone for the great questions in the chat. We're going to get to as many of those as we can now. There are a number of questions about demand and projected demand and how that plays out in Minnesota. But first, Abby, there's one that's directly related to your presentation, so I thought we'd start there. The question is like, why are these metals going to the landfill instead of recycling? Like what is going on such that, so many of these metals are going into the dump? And that's a question for, I think, all three of us.
I mean, I would say probably a lack of comprehensive waste management planning, because, metals are very different. It can be rebar in a building, or it can be like the precious metals in your cell phone. And all of the regulations, I think, have kind of been reactive and piecemeal. So I would say that's one barrier to having like a very comprehensive, sustainable materials management regulatory scheme. Anybody else have thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm reflecting on some of the subsidies that were inherent to Catherine's presentation for mining, and I think it is important to be clear that we do provide a lot of direct and indirect subsidies for mining. Just a few examples of indirect subsidies. Water appropriations are quite cheap in Minnesota. It's about $8 per million gallons of water. That's just not a lot. Direct subsidies, even in the recent Federal Inflation Reduction Act, there's a 10% tax credit for operational expenses for mining companies. So there's direct subsidies like that. And then you could extend that even to subsidies of the fossil fuels used in the production of metals. So I think the types of subsidies we see for the mining industry, we just haven't seen yet for recycling. Have we encouraged, enterprising behavior in terms of like getting those metals back out of the current economy? Great. So we have 3 questions about demand. I think they're all really interesting. So we're going to turn to that now. Just so the panelists have an idea of what's coming, I'll share briefly about all 3. So the first is about it's about how much copper PolyMet would produce and how that compares to other metrics. The second is about whether we use demand projections in the state permitting process. And the third is about seabed mining. And the question is about large-scale mining of metal-containing nodules in the Pacific, which I hadn't actually heard of, but I think we can speak to that at least indirectly too. So, I'll just kick us off here with the question about how much copper PolyMet would produce. So the main metal PolyMet is proposing to mine in Minnesota is copper. And a few things to know about that is it's a very low-grade deposit, less than 1% copper. So obviously most of what's produced is actually waste rock. So if PolyMet were to move forward and were to be operational, it would produce over its lifespan about 0.2% of the global supply of copper. So actually quite an insignificant amount when it comes to how much copper is used worldwide. We've done a little research about what that would mean in terms of how that compares to recycling, and could we get those same metals from recycling? And one thing to note about that is that data is hard to track down. We have to reverse engineer a lot of it because we have to go to places like the IEA and the US Geological Service. There's not a lot of good state level data for how much recycling of copper would be needed to meet the PolyMet production. But what we've conservatively estimated is if the US raised its recycling of copper levels to even close to what the EU does, from approximately the low 30% to 50 to 60%, that alone, just that increase in recycling, which is clearly currently possible, would equal 13 PolyMet mines. So that's one comparison, that we've looked at in terms of like, what does this really mean for, the global supply chain if PolyMet were operational? And Catherine, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for how do these demand projections play out in the state permitting process? Do our agencies look at demand when they're evaluating a company's proposal?
Yeah, so they do in a way, but not in a way that I find to be very effective. And so this can be maybe a little wonky from a legal perspective, but bear with me for a minute, okay? So the environmental review process in Minnesota starts with a scoping process where they ask, okay, here's an idea, it's a proposed mine, tell us what we should be evaluating. And people can put in public comments and they say things like tribal resources or water quality or water appropriations or jobs, all the kinds of things that people want to know more about when there's a mining proposal. And then based on that, the agency identifies the purpose, the scope, and the purpose of the project. And this is a really important moment, okay? Because they're asking the question, what are we trying to achieve here? And if the answer is we're trying to build a mine, which is the way that our laws are written, then that's probably the answer you're going to get, that we should build a mine. They could ask a question like, or they could say the purpose is something like to fulfill metals demand. Well, that's interesting. Maybe it shouldn't be a mine at all. Maybe it should be something else. So you can define the purpose of the project broadly or narrowly based on what the agency is trying to achieve. Once that purpose is defined, and I'll use Polymet as an example because it's the one that's gone through this process most recently. And in that case, they did say the purpose was to build a mine and to fulfill demand for metals through the building of that mine or something like that. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the exact language in front of me. At that point, you're kind of locked in to some assumptions about, what's going to happen next and what the demand is. And more than that, what we saw were, and we see this through many environmental review processes, is too much project proponent control over what's in the EIS. So as an example, the jobs report, how many jobs is Polymet going to create? Well, Polymet got to commission and create that report, and it only counts the positive side of the ledger, right? What jobs are we creating? And then there's secondary jobs. Nobody ever looked at, are there tourism jobs or other types of jobs that are going to be destroyed because you've built a big industrial complex or you've polluted water or things like that. No one ever looked at that. And that was too much project proponent control over what's in there. Similarly, with minerals demand, we do see too much of that data coming from the mining companies. And so, and this is, I think, actually a broad possibility for reform within the environmental review process is, more agency creation and origination of data. So not relying on the project proponent as much for what goes in there. Often they commission a lot of the scientific studies, and then they go into that environmental review, and the agency is just kind of looking at them and saying, yeah, is this good enough? Or does it seem like this study fulfills the purpose we wanted? Okay, fine, we'll put it in. But that's not good enough because we really do want a balanced environmental review process. So for things like job projections, of course, environmental impact and minerals demand, we do want more of that to come from the public agencies and the public comment and less of it to come from the project proponent.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And by the way, folks, we've got 31 questions in the chat, so it's great to see all this energy from folks. We're probably going to get to maybe 6 or 8, so apologies in advance for not being able to get to all of them, but thanks so much for all the great energy. So on this question of seabed mining, I'm curious if Catherine and Abby have heard of this. My thoughts immediately go to, we've had this discussion of demand projections, and one of the things we've been very careful to point out is, the assumptions on which demand projections are based. And we've pointed out that, we are constantly in a process of, producing substitute technologies and substitute materials. And 2 recent examples in the United States are PVC piping and fiber optics in place of copper piping and copper wiring. So this is, to me, and I don't know anything about seabed mining, but it sounds like another example of there are probably other ways to produce some of these materials that we don't know about yet. So basically, how much stock ought we be putting in these projections, and how does that relate to the conversation as a whole?
Yeah. Abby, do you mind if I jump in here? I actually don't know a lot about seabed mining either, to be honest. I'm aware of that New York Times article that the commenter mentioned, and I have not had a chance to really dig into it. In general, though, mines don't make good neighbors. Right. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that mining companies are looking in places where there isn't local opposition. Right. And so that's one issue that probably needs to be addressed through international treaties or law and is beyond the scope of the CLE. I was thinking about this question of these projections and how we act on them that JT is posing. And, what we're proposing to all of you today is we need to look at reuse, recycling, reduction, and then as a very last resort, responsible mining, because mining has an impact regardless of where it happens. It has an environmental impact, even when done well, it has a big environmental impact. And often it's near tribal resources and other places that we should be protecting as a society and not destroying. And so this idea that we would, do seabed mining or build mines now in order to fulfill this projected demand, to me is out of order. because we haven't explored the reuse, recycling, and reduction options first. And so we don't even know how much of that mineral demand we can fulfill by optimizing those, but we know that's going to be the cleanest, the easiest, and the fastest way to do it. So we should be acting on that now and leaving mining proposals, especially damaging ones, off the table for now. People will sometimes say to me, well, we know we're probably going to need some mining, so why wouldn't we just build this mine? And to me, it's like the analogy I was thinking of is, is dessert for my kids, right? My kids know they're going to get dessert at the end of a meal on a Friday night, and they're pretty smart. And so they might say, well, let me eat dessert first, right? I'll just take dessert now. And dessert of mining for mining companies, that's dessert, right? Because there's a big payoff in terms of making money. But I know that if they eat dessert, they might not do any of the other. They might not eat their dinner or their vegetables. So I don't let them do it. So let's do the reuse, recycling, and reduction first, and leave mining off the table until we fully explore those opportunities.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So there are several questions about the Minnesota legislature. And they are along the lines of, is the legislature looking at this? How can we encourage the legislature to look more closely at promoting recycling? Are there incentives currently for companies to recapture more of these metals?
I have some thoughts on that, but I want to give Abby a chance to weigh in if she would like to.
Well, the one that comes to mind is for e-waste. We do have an extended producer responsibility policy for some electronics. So that's good that we have that policy. It does increase recycling, and Minnesota, I think, is a leader in that regard from what studies I've read. And related to e-waste actually is a bill called Right to Repair, that has gotten hearings a couple sessions ago, that is pretty interesting from the perspective that, it could reduce demand for, new electronics that are very metal intensive, which is of interest from this conversation because, we have a finite amount of metals. We want to reduce consumption economy-wide. So the Right to Repair bill would make it easier for people to repair their phones and other electronics by bolstering a third-party repair market. So yeah, that's one bill that comes to mind. I'm not sure what the status of it is, honestly.
Yeah, I think that, Abby spent a lot of time with the PCA proposals, and I do think there's some potential to partner with the state agencies to get some of this work done. And it does, I think, the Minnesota legislature for getting mining laws passed has been a rough ride lately, to be honest with you all. However, I think the recycling and reuse has the potential to be more bipartisan and less controversial. And so I do think there's a lot of opportunity, and we will be, one of the things that's happening here, I don't know, we didn't necessarily go through the whole context, but MCA has launched this blog series and this whole conversation around mining the climate crisis. And one of the things we're doing as part of this is exploring these policy options and how do we get them done. And so that's kind of the next phase for us now that we've done a lot of this research that we're presenting to you today, is how do we actually enact these reforms? So that's kind of the next step for us. We'll be asking you to call your legislature if you're an MCA donor.
Sounds good. Thanks both. So I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. One I think is fairly brief, which is, are we tracking the power used by the industry for primary metal production? And the answer to that briefly is yes. I mean, we do know how much power mining companies use. That information is publicly available. I think one of the reasons this question is a good one is it's good to be aware that, primary production of metals is a hugely carbon intensive process. So even though, we're kind of seeing this new rhetoric about the industry being partners in climate action, it's, we do need to be eyes wide open about the fact that it is a very intensive process. And, more than that, it's also much more intensive than recycling. It's much more efficient to actually recapture and recycle metals than to produce new primary metals. So that's just a distinction that's important to be clear about. Catherine, Abby, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I would just add that there's a big intersection to our work at the Public Utilities Commission here. MCA is involved in all of the planning that utilities do to figure out how they're going to fulfill energy demand. And we do hear this tension of we need to keep coal plants open up on the range or build new gas plants, this NTEC facility, in order to fulfill the demand from mining companies. That's kind of justified. And so one of the things, we didn't really talk about this, but one thing that some mining companies doing around the world, and I would love to see in Minnesota, is local generation. So solar or wind on the site in order to fulfill the energy demand so that you're not pulling off a grid and making, Minnesota Power, in this case, feel like they need to have more fossil fuel generation to power your mine.
Great. So we've got time for one more question, and it is kind of an all-encompassing question, which is basically, and there's several in the chat box that are along these lines, but the question is basically, what do we think of the new presentation by the industry as partners in climate action? Like, do we need mining companies for climate action? Do we need more primary metals for EV batteries, et cetera, et cetera? So we're gonna close with that question. I'll start with just some broad brush strokes that relate to the presentations from Catherine and Abby today. But, we've seen that, if we do continue to build new vehicles, for example, at the rates projected, that will require new metals, right? So that we've seen the projections, those are the projections, yes. We also certainly agree that we need to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, absolutely yes. I think the danger here, and we see this in a lot of the current conversation in the media and in the public, is if we have too narrow a focus, we're really at risk of not achieving our broader goals. And by too narrow a focus, I mean if we only focus on producing more energy through new metals, we're missing out on a lot of the picture. So science is very clear that we're not just in an emissions and energy crisis, we're in an emissions, pollution, and biodiversity crisis. And of course, mining has dramatic impacts across all of these areas. So, I think it's interesting that the Biden principles do acknowledge that this is a complicated picture. It's not just, we need this to do that. It's a much more complicated conversation. And I think it's one of the reasons MCEA is so engaged in it, is this isn't the type of thing we can answer, in little sound bites, which is a lot of what's happening, I would say, right now in the media. Catherine, Abby?
Well said.
I'll just add that, mining as an industry is not well regulated, not only here, but in some other parts of the world. And so mines not being great neighbors have in some ways created this situation themselves. So this narrative that they're building around wanting to be clean energy partners is interesting, but these mining companies would have a lot less local opposition if we had models of good mines, right? I mean, people dismiss it as NIMBYism, but the reality is that the impact is bad every time. We don't have good models. And so if the mining company is serious about being partners in a transition to a clean energy economy, I would love to see them invest in better models and clean up their act.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Abby. And thanks, everyone, for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our YouTube page and will be posted on our website, Facebook, and Twitter accounts within 24 hours. Thanks again for joining us so much, and stay tuned for invites to future webinars.